All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Cutlass Podcast. I hope this finds you well. If you're a new listener, welcome. I hope that you enjoy what you hear and you find it useful in your leadership and management development efforts. There are 51 other episodes you can check out, so I encourage you to check out the Cutlass Podcast. It's on most of the podcast channels and platforms that are out there. Like it, favorite, and follow it. And welcome back to those loyal listeners that are out there or those who have subscribed. Thanks again for your support and feedback that you continue to provide as we move along and grow the channel. So, all right. So in past episodes, I have covered many different topics of interpersonal one-on-one communication. We've talked about listening skills. We've talked about oral communication and how to develop your speaking skills. I've talked about the importance of reading and writing. So I encourage you to check those episodes out. But as you move up into organizations, your communication skills will continue to broaden, and you'll have to look at communication skills and communication more broadly and organizationally. So things are going to change. And I thought it would be a great topic to talk about that. Number one, for younger listeners to understand that, hey, start thinking about those things different. But for our older listeners or more experienced ones that may be in these positions, maybe plant some seeds of how they can think about their role in strategic communication and how they can use those things. So with me to discuss this today, I'm welcoming back retired Sergeant Major now, Scott Stalker. Scott served over 30 years in the Marine Corps, a variety of leadership positions, culminating with two, the senior enlisted leader for both cyber and space commands. And he's now founder of Stalker Solutions. He's on several boards, advisory and regular boards, and he's a senior fellow for the National Defense University. So with this experience base and what he's done and kind of our relationship together and conversations we've had, I thought he'd be a perfect person to bring on for this discussion. So Scott, welcome back. How are things been with you?
Hey, good to have you back, Paul. Good to be back, Paul. Thank you. It's been great. I retired on the 7th of August. And since that point, it's been 100 miles an hour. We took some time off as a family to go see some things. And then I started my own company. As you mentioned, retiring 31 years, culminating as a master gunnery sergeant there, and just love what I did, where I was at. And we settled here in North Carolina. And now, while I keep track of what's going on, worldly affairs, and I'm mindful of everything, really now everything is about business and things that I'm doing here as a business owner and a consultant or a senior fellow with the National Defense University. So I'm still figuring out this whole retirement thing. I still lean on you and others to tell me how it goes. But it's been great so far. And again, thank you for having me back, sir.
No, absolutely. You've got a perspective, you've got an experience set. I mean, this conversation, you've got to have that experience to have it, right, and have dealt with these kind of things. So you came to mind for this immediately, and I'm glad you had the opportunity to do it. So congratulations on your retirement. Yes, like we're saying, it's been 5 years for me, and I'm like, man, it went fast, but you quickly align to a new kind of model. So maybe that's an episode we can do in the future too. Something on.
Would love to. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think that's a great one we could do. I think there's a big appetite for that kind of content out there. So, all right.
Well, because it's the unknown, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything that's unknown, I want to talk to someone who's been there and done that. And so the reason I come to you for the unknown is because I trust you. Yeah. And I know you've gone through it, and we have similar career tracks there in the naval service and understanding things. And you're someone I admired, obviously, in service too. So that when you can get someone you trust who's crossed the unknown, I want to hear what they have to say about it.
Absolutely. And just because service stops, I'm telling you, I don't do any of this to get rich. I want to give back, right? So we've learned a lot. I've written books and done those kind of things, but I think this is a great way to pass on knowledge and experience. Human societies have done that forever. So I think that's a huge part of it, the ability to give back and make it easier for other people to succeed if they're willing to take on the advice and the learning that we've gotten. So, all right. So let's talk about communication and how it changes as you move up. Obviously we all started tactical, and like we put, and I want to remind listeners, we have military backgrounds, but this translates to civilian level stuff too, right? So as you move up in civilian corporations or businesses, this model applies, right? So how does communication change from your perspective as you move up, and why does it change?
I think people need to realize what communication first is. And I know that sounds simplistic and I'm dodging what you're asking for, but ultimately 80% of communication is nonverbal. And so that when you move, whether you're in a senior position in the Department of Defense or you're in business, and I'm a member of a board, I'm talking to a CEO or other board members, being mindful of that 80%, those nonverbal cues, your appearance, that you're dressed for the appropriate occasion. And that could be, you're at a pool party, roger that, you're in swim trunks, or if you're in the board meeting, you're in a coat and tie or appropriate for a female as well. And so being mindful of those nonverbal cues, being attentive, looking someone in the eye, having the right body language, all those little things lead into that final 20% when you're being articulate and you're speaking and you're using words and that sort of thing. But having the energy is critical to that. So when I left the military, which was something I know a lot about, and I understand being a Marine and a senior enlisted leader, and then I went up and got into business, the first thing I spent time on was learning that tactical, the daily employees kind of what they do in their role and what the company does, so that when I sit in the board meetings, I can provide context to the CEO, to the senior vice president, whatever, because we're now talking at that strategic level. But if you don't have the tactical perspective in the lower level context, it's hard to give advice on certain things. You got to understand the environment. But that environment could be the financial environment. It could be the physical environment. All of those, it could be the competition as well. But you got to really understand all of that so that when you do communicate, you do it effectively. Understanding, again, nonverbal cues, how you're being perceived, how people see you. And then that last 20% is actually what you say. And how you say it could be in an email and making sure that that is professionally well written, or it could be, how we're speaking right now. And then I would also offer the one thing that's slightly different, at least my time so far, in my experience so far, is there's not a whole lot of rank out here. It's good morning, Paul. When I talk to CEOs who have been seniors, one of them is a retired 3-star. He's like, hey, first name is this. And it's just that, and that's where we go with it. And we're just respectful in that way. So you just have to get comfortable speaking to individuals. And first name, if you read a lot of business books out there, one of my favorite talks about how the most powerful thing you can say to anyone is their first name. Yep. And that power of the first name is incredibly important in remembering that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think, as you move up, you think at organization, right? So I think, when you're starting at smaller levels in the organization, there's a lot of interpersonal communication, right? So one-on-one with small teams, talking about day-to-day kind of stuff. And then as you move up, who you speak with changes, right? Who your targets are. And I think we'll get a little bit into that later about, strategic communication plans, but, and then the organization and how you view it, to your point about context changes, the things you're trying to communicate and what you're trying to influence with that communication change. Teams become geographically dispersed. So as you move up, you might be in the headquarters of a military command or the executive offices of a big company, but your teams are dispersed perhaps around the state, the country, or even the globe. So now distance becomes a factor that factors into it as well. So, and then you'll hear about strategic communication. So I think I want to pause and talk about that a little bit, because that word strategy, I think people make it more than it needs to be, right? So I wrote down strategic, right? When we think strategic communication. So when you're being strategic, that's your organizational plan of action to achieve a goal under conditions of uncertainty. So it's really back to planning, right? It's a plan, but you're factoring in uncertainty. And I think sometimes you're also factoring in budgetary limitations, right? So I want to achieve a goal under certain conditions, but some constraints are possible too. So it makes you have trade-off decisions as well. So when you hear strategic communication, what does that mean to you? And how do you think that differs from one-on-one interpersonal communication?
Yeah, I think that's the key to all of this here. And this is where I've found in uniform, you have good senior enlisted leaders or commanders, but I'm also seeing it in business now as well. So you touched on it, strategic communications is an end state. There's a goal there where the best, whether you're a senior enlisted leader, a commander, a business person or whatever, I have found those that strategically communicate the best are able to do that by anticipating. And what I mean by that is I know what the company's goals are. And I don't need the boss telling me every day, I want to be what I call a fire and forget weapon. So I understand what we're trying to achieve. We want to double in size. We want to win that contract, whatever the case may be. And I tell everyone, let's win every single thing we do. Let's win the handshake. Let's win the email. Let's win the conversation. Let's win the professionalism and focus on the process, understanding the strategic goal we're trying to achieve. And if we focus on the process and winning every little sector of that in kindness and professionalism and educating folks along the way, we are elevating that into a strategic level conversation and a strategic level thought process, because everything we do is relentlessly in pursuit of that company and objective company goal. And so you and I have been in these meetings before, and we'll have, a boss say something or other, and they won't maybe look at us and tell us to go attack it. But we anticipate, wow, I heard them say this. I know what's getting ready to happen. Let me address that in a variety of ways. I could fly out there. I can have a conversation or whatever. And it's the same thing in business. Wow, the boss is saying this in business. I just saw an opportunity. I'm going to anticipate, and I'm just going to take it for action because I'm thinking strategically going forward. So I think it's really elevating our mindset, anticipating where those leaders are at, and knowing where the company goals are, and then executing with it instead of waiting, which is what you do more at that tactical level, for the junior boss to tell you because you don't have the experience. And so all we're talking about here is elevating our mindset, having an enterprise approach to what we do instead of myopically focusing on my little thing. I want to talk about the entirety of the enterprise, whether that's the larger department of the Navy or, pick your company, instead of me just talking about my little thing and my little piece of the pie. And that takes time. And some folks either don't want to get there or don't get there because they don't step back and get out of that operational and strategic level and look larger picture at the strategic piece that's out there.
Absolutely.
And be able to think of the enterprise. Excuse me. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think you already said that the strategic communication plan, if there is one, should be one, I think. It may not be called that where you're at, but typically that's what it is. It is linked to the organization's strategic plan too, right? Which outlines the mission, the vision, the goals, the lines of objective, how you're going to measure those, what measured performance you're going to have. So let's, and then, hopefully you've got a strategic communication plan. I think it's a management, there's leadership in it, but like I've talked in other episodes, this is management too, right? You have to plan it. You have to organize your resources. You have to execute the plan, and then you got to follow up, right? You got to measure it and adjust as you need to. So you are in the management process when you're executing this strategic plan. So what's been your experience with strategic communication plans? Have you seen them? Are they the norm or the exception? And what are the components that you see? I've got some things written down. I want to talk through those each, but what's been your experience with shaping and executing strategic communication plans?
Yeah, I think this is another important one too, because there's a variety of ways to get the message out, and there's a variety of audiences you're always messaging, regardless of how you're doing it. My experience is both good and negative, if you will. I've seen a lot of folks reluctant to put a message out, and they make a lot of fear-based decisions, and they what if, oh my God, what if this was bad? What if it's not received right? Instead of trusting and empowering the communications professionals that you have, letting them know the 3 or 4 things you want to get across, and then putting forward a strategic messaging campaign, a strategic vision, and how we're going to talk through it. So I've seen that not go so well, to the point where we just put out something that was so vanilla, it actually was counterproductive. On the other side, even in the intelligence community, I've seen us put out great messages. Just to pat the CIA on the back. I saw a cartoon a commercial they just put out on Twitter a few days ago, taking advantage of an opportunity of some, of all the challenging times going on in Russia. And I thought it was brilliant how they did that. And it was classy. And obviously I don't think anyone's going to, retweet that and say, hey, I'm here at this address, recruit me to be a spy. It's more than that. But the point is they put the message out. And to me, it instilled great pride in those that work there. So the other piece of this too, though, Paul, is knowing who you're communicating with, both internal and external. And if you're in uniform, that external is going to be the adversary, right? So if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs comes out right now and says some things, he may be talking to the folks in front of him, but if it's being recorded, the Chinese are going to listen to it. The Russians are going to listen to it. They're going to look at where he's at. They're going to look at every little piece of that and pull it apart. And so you always have to be mindful of, if you're communicating externally, the adversary, the competitor is listening as well, right? So, okay, I'm the head of company X, and I'm saying we're going to target this sector of the economy, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. All my competition is hearing that. They're seeing how they can beat me to it, and so on and so forth. So there's a need to communicate as a leader, to inspire your teammates, to educate and inform your teammates. And if you can keep that in the house, then there's, you can say certain things. But if it's going to go external as well, you have to be aware of who is hearing this and how they can perceive that as well. So it's just, it's a lot to it. But that strategic communications message you talked about, I've had 2 conversations with separate companies since I've been retired about the importance of doing that. And I'm working with them to do that. And, using social media, using YouTube, using websites, podcasts, all those things. Yep. I mean, today on your phone, you have your own television channel and you can put things out. Try to do that in a strategic way and in an educated and informed way to get across the message you're trying to get out to everybody.
Yeah, I think the plan should outline, again, I'm going to break down some of these, gets into the fundamental, like who, what, when, where, why kind of messaging. Like, who do you want to talk about? What do I want to say? What am I trying to achieve? So the first thing, to your point, target audience, primary, you have a primary audience, and then the secondary audience is the one you're talking about. Or, there may be an intended secondary audience, but there may be an unintended audience that's out there as well. So to your point, that's something to consider with that. And then I think when you talk about, I've always heard that, and you've heard this too, right? My up and out messaging and my down and in messaging, right? So I have, typically if I have a vision to move something, or I have a broader initiative or a policy I'm trying to move, there's probably the down and in messaging to my people within the company. But then there's also an up and out message audience that I want to highlight, who can, I want to socialize. Hey, look at what we're doing, right? Kind of like brand recognition kind of messaging that you do. So again, that's the first thing you got to take time to think about, just like with interpersonal communication, right? If you're doing a public speech, who's my audience? What are they about? Kind of thing. You brought this up already, the second component, context. Why does context matter? And what does that mean in when you're talking strategic communication plan?
Well, I think, whether Simon Sinek is saying start with why, or we're saying, the importance of context, what you're giving folks is purpose. You're letting them know the larger strategic message, why we're doing this. Why do I need my employees on this VTC at 8 a.m. in the morning? Why do I need them all in the office on this day? Why do I need us stopping work here and picking up work here? It's context. And if you don't fill that void, it gets filled with rumors. It gets filled with, a second line leader who may not have all that context, trying to fill that in. And so you're putting that second line leader in a bad place. I think context is incredibly important. What I have also found, though, is no matter how often you communicate and how effectively communicate, you can do a daily all hands, a podcast, an email. There's still going to be some that don't get it for whatever reason, or aren't paying attention to that. They just know their little area. And so as long as you're communicating that out and the leadership understands the greater context, they know why, how their piece of the pie fits in. And I just think, if you don't have that context and you don't have all the folks rowing in the same direction, and at least they understand why they're doing that, there's going to be problems and challenges down at the lower level. That's where lack of context is felt the most. When those leaders down at the lowest level don't understand why they're doing some things, why not round the corner? Why not, use a little less torque on that wrench or whatever, because they don't see where it fits into the bigger picture and how all of their actions contribute to greater profit for the company, to greater morale for the company, for an opportunity to be a more lethal unit if you're in the Department of Defense, whatever the case may be. So context is critical. And I think without it, what you're going to see is a company that's the next Circuit City, the next Blockbuster, because they're just doing things because that's how it's always been done, instead of pivoting and evolving with the times and where the market's taking you. And so you can be relevant in the future.
Yeah. I think right before I retired and, towards the end of your career, you could see the context changing right within DoD, right? The narrative of the shift to high-end competition, the move away from, that Fifth Fleet focus, Middle East focus, anti-terrorism stuff we were doing in a higher focus on high-end peer, right? Russia, China, and setting the conditions and the context for, hey, we're going to be updating how we operate, right? We're going to be updating a lot of things and getting that message down, right? Deployment cycles are going to be different. How we use our stuff is going to be different. Some things are going to go away. We're going to stop doing things like this. The context is the broader context of what's going on in the world and within competition globally is going to impact your day-to-day, right? It may not impact how you turn a wrench or things like that, but it will impact where you turn that wrench and where you go on a ship and things like that. So I think that's one practical way I think we can say that too, that it really does happen when you think about context.
Paul, I think too, if I can add to that, over the next few weeks here, we're going to see all of this play out where our service secretaries and our service chiefs, and even the senior enlisted leaders in the next few days are going to get in front of Congress and they're going to communicate. And they know as they prepare for this, obviously, they've got to give those leaders their best military advice. That's an oath they took. They're also mindful of the fact of what they say is going to be heard by the Russians, the Chinese, and other adversaries and competitors as well. And so, balancing that out with being honest, saying maybe I need to take this for the record or into a skiff to have a conversation in private. But all this is going to play out here shortly over the next few weeks with our service chiefs laying that out. And they're going to give us, in many ways, the context. And I'm not talking about the sound bites that are going to be played by different media venues to highlight and emphasize their points. But if you listen to the whole thing, which I try to do every year, everything they say, they're going to give you the context where, maybe the Marine Corps, which has recently said, hey, we need more ships in order to create to execute more Marine Expeditionary Unit deployments. Probably the Secretary of the Navy is going to let us know why we don't have those ships and why we need, this is the context to Congress, why we need more money to fund those ships in order to execute our national defense strategy and national security strategy. So all of this is a higher level of context, but it's still important for that audience and the external one as well.
And that's a good example, great example of, again, back to the plan, right? So like I mentioned, the down and in, you've got those communication, but that congressional testimony is kind of an up and out communication, right? Like, so I have a message for the broader strategic goals. My team is going to do this piece of it, but then I need a message to Congress, what I need from them for me to achieve my goals, right? So again, different audiences, but the context for all of those is the same, so it's cool how that plays out. All right. The third thing you should capture in that plan is the intended outcomes. Right. I think we talked about that earlier, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's not just the intended outcomes, but deliverables and timeline, right? So I don't want to say, hey, I need to double our profits. I want to say specifically, I need us to double our profits by the second quarter and then work our way back on how we're going to get there. In order to do that, I've got to be able to hire X amount of employees. I got to focus on our greater return on investment areas, all of those things as well. But the timeline matters because I have found that without that timeline, without us, and there's a lot of those going on in the National Defense Strategy. You've heard of of the Davidson window of 2027. The others are out there, 2035, all these other timelines that are out there for that specific event as well, which then gives leaders who believe in that Davidson window, so to speak, to say, this is why I need to have the funding in by this year to build the ships or to have the aircraft or whatever the case may be. And so without the timeline, you just have a bunch of wildly important goals that are moderately amusing. But I have to work. Me personally, everything I do is I'll set those goals and I work myself backwards on a timeline. You want to lose 5 pounds? No problem. Probably can't do it today, but give me a few days and I'll work backwards and I can get there. So I think the timeline matched with that strategic communications, matched with the deliverables and the goals, you put that together and then you communicate that with your leaders, whether they're commanders and chiefs or vice presidents, whatever the case may be. Communicate that, socialize it with them, get them to give you feedback as well, because it shouldn't be just a one-way communication stream. And then you may have to make some adjustments, based on some great feedback you get. And at some point, we got to execute. Everyone's had their opportunity to give their thoughts and opinions, just like an election. At a certain point, that election has a consequence, and we got to move out and row the boat in the same direction.
Awesome. Fourth component, the key messages, right? I think this is the what part of it all. So we've covered the who, the why, the what, and the when, or the how and when, or perhaps the key messages is the how. So what are your thoughts on key messages in your plan and advice on getting those out? What's that all about?
Yeah, I think, at least for the things that I have done, there's two bins. There's talent and then there's technology. And what we're going to do with the talent and what we're going to do with the technology, I think is relevant. So for talent, for humans, what we're going to do, this is how we are going to educate our employees. Here's the expectations of all of our employees, not just the minimum, because that's easy, right? Show up to work, breathe air. No, I expect all of you to focus on your own personal development, or if you've been doing this for 3 years, you're going to PCS, and if you don't get promoted, it's time for you to leave the service. A variety of these things as well. And then on the technology side, the stuff, if you will, this is the context of why we're going to invest in this new technology, whether it's a large language model that's going to help us sift through a lot of data, or it's an aircraft carrier, or it's new technology on a submarine or a jet, you name it. It's in kind of those two bins. One is talent, and one is technology. Technology being things and stuff that tangibles, if you will. And then messaging how we're going to invest in our people, how we're going to promote our people, how we're going to recruit talent, retain talent, all of those bins. I think that's the what, at least as I understand it, getting to that. And again, socializing this, having a communications. We have this discussion in the armed forces a lot about talent management. And I have always thought it's the wrong choice of words there. I believe more importantly, it should be about talent utilization. So for example, if I invest in Paul and I send you to a university to get a degree, I don't want to manage that so much as I want to utilize it. How do I get, as the United States Navy, the most out of what I just invested in you? And I do that by having a conversation before I send you to school and say, upon completion, here are the 3 or 4 places I plan to send you because I need that skill set here. I don't need an Arabic linguist potentially in South America, but because you just learned Spanish, I'm going to put you down in the Southcom AOR. That's simplistic, but the point is that utilize the talent. And I see it a lot more in the commercials, in the private sector than I did in the military, at least where I came from, there's an opening, we're going to put you there, you get the pay grade and the basic qualifications. I think the graduate level work being done is how do I do talent utilization? And that gets to the what of the individuals and how we're going to manage them and eventually create senior leaders within the organization from the beginning to the end. I retain that talent because I've utilized it appropriately and invested in it.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is where you can also reinforce the WIFM or what's in it for me with these key messages.
Amen.
And as we went around, I remember, again, I would have probably, if I was doing a call with people, there'd be 3 or 5, probably not even 5, probably 3 key messages I wanted to highlight and emphasize. I think that was enough to digest. What was your experience with that?
Well, maybe because I'm not the brilliant mathematician that I like to pretend I am, but I keep everything to three, and I'll bin off of those three. I'll keep them, larger pieces of conversation, and then I can sub out of them, whatever topic I can, have national security as one, and within that, I'm talking Russia, China, and Iran. Okay, boom. Let me talk to you a little bit about Russia. Let me talk to you a bit about China. Let me talk about Russia. Within those conversations, now I can give you context that the reason the budget is shaped this way is because of the national security implications. And number three, the reason the resources are a certain way is because over the last few years, we've seen inflation and it costs more, people cost more, and so on and so forth. So I've been almost everything I do. And I don't know that I was taught this or learned this. I just happened to be this way. Someone probably taught it to me and I don't even realize it. But everything I do, I keep in the bins of three. And then, I may subcategorize some things as well, but even that won't be greater than three. And it's just a way that my brain works. Simple. So if I'm giving a 1 hour presentation, I don't necessarily have to memorize my speech. I just remember the three big things.
Yeah.
And then, national defense strategy. You want me to talk about economy and technology? Boom. I can speak for an hour on that easily because I've memorized the three big components. And then I just, talk about the subcategories as well.
And then also as senior enlisted leader, being involved in the messaging, right, and the drafting of the plan and the development of the messages. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit.
Yeah.
Fifth component, the channel, I call them the channels of communication. So that's the how. How are we going to communicate? So what are the channels that you frequently use to deliver kind of strategic messaging?
Well, you certainly have your trusted advisors and your trusted teammates, and that could be what we'll refer to in the Marine Corps and others is, that command team. And they're going to put the message out. And while they are trusted advisors, there are times, and there's a reason why Congress wants to hear from the senior enlisted leaders, just like, folks in other units may not always want to hear it from the commanding general or the commandant. They may want to hear it from their platoon sergeant or the lieutenant because they've got that relationship, very, very close relationship. So it's trusted advisors and then, middle management, lower management as well. And then there's means of how you're going to do this. What method are you going to do? So when you and I first came in, we'd have an all hands formation, whether it was on the flight deck or, out in the field. It didn't matter. We would get everyone together and we would communicate with the team. And that's the way we did it. Now in this way of global, we're global, we can communicate anywhere. What tools are you using is critical. And a lot of those are social media and sticking to the facts, using data and sticking to the point is critical. Instead of a lot of the things that are out there now, you'll see a headline and the headline barely matches what the article is talking about, but it's really grabbing attention. And so you're fighting against that. But using email, text messaging, phone, there's a plethora of tools. Quite frankly, we could probably spend days talking about all the tools. But the most important piece of all of this is knowing how your people receive information. And if none of them are email people, then you sending out the daily email is probably a waste of your time and certainly a waste of theirs. You've got to meet the audience where they are. And this is something, we think about as we talk about recruiting in the military. If you're not where those that are in high school are at, you're going to have a hard time recruiting. There's one day a year, and it's going to be in a couple of weeks here, where everyone watches TV, not for the product so much as often for the commercials. And that's the Super Bowl. We literally have people that will do YouTube channels and social media after action reports on the commercials that are out there. And so I said all the time, man, that's a great opportunity to get the brand out there to talk about, the honor of serving in the armed forces as well. And we'll see if they take me up on that. But the point is know where the audience is, meet them there, effectively communicate in the arena they're at if you're hoping to get your message across.
Yeah. And I think you find these days, at least I have. So, I've served in some, like I was the president for the Non-Commissioned Officer Association for 3 years. And then you're talking about an age, demographic from 80s down to, new people. So we found there was an appetite still for paper kind of stuff, but I know if I'm going to reach out to millennial Gen Z, I've got to be on social, right? I've got to have social media and not just one, not just Facebook, because that's
Yeah.
very age related, right? So,
Right.
you got to be on all the stuff that's out there. I'm with you. I was always a fan of all the channels, use them all, consistent messaging. But those key messages should be captured regardless of what you're going to do. But yeah, there's a lot of cool tools like this now that you can use that are out there. So I'm with you. There's a bunch of them. All right. And then finally, the messenger, right? Who's going to tell the message and deliver it? So why is that important to have identified in the plan? And how do you decide who that should be?
There are certain moments when only the boss can do certain things, right? So the State of the Union address cannot be done by the vice president or just pick somebody. There's a time and a place where we got to hear from the boss. And oftentimes those are in defined moments, whether that is, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, State of the Union address, or things like that. But they're also in tragedy. And one of the moments you and I have talked about in the past is a fallen shipmate of our senior chief, Shannon Kent, and being at her memorial there at the Naval Academy. Yeah. And that was when General Dunford, as the chairman, got up and gave remarks, because only he could do that in the power of that. And then the CNO presented her family with a medal along with the MCPON. And then the National Security Agency director as well, John Nakasone, and I was there. We presented things to the family. And that was a moment where you couldn't outsource that to anyone else. That had to be the leader, and only the leader could do that. But that's not all the time. And so you have to know who are the other, whether they're, people that just generally have that aura about them that can communicate and people are going to listen to, or whatever. But having that other tranche that's not always a leadership one that's passing out the information. So depending on the moment and the time, you got to, tag the right person, make sure they're communicating because they're trusted, and go from there. But rarely does it need to always come from the boss, but there are moments when it can only come from the boss. And you'll hear this in certain circles that 4-star or whatever senior leader, CEO, needs to know when it can only come from them, and they're the one that's going to have to deliver that message. So I think that's the balance of what's the context that we're talking about. Is this tragedy? Is this coming from the company, happy birthday type thing that is important, or is it just routine daily things that the COO, the command senior enlisted leader, the first sergeant, the senior chief petty officer, whatever, that they can deliver, and then outsourcing it? Because the counterproductive thing here is that if the boss is the only one always talking, or only the one sending on the email, at a certain point, we tone them out. I think in many ways, less is more here. And while we do need to hear from the boss, we can't hear from the boss every single day, or it's not as relevant.
Yeah. I think it's definitely linked to the target audience, right? And who are they most apt to trust at a given time, right? And we saw this a lot, right? So definitely within the military, there's all kinds of different target audiences, right? So there's your active duty component, there's enlisted, there's officers, there's military spouses and families, right? So who talks to who about what? Yes, that the boss should be flexible enough to talk to all of them with trust and credibility. But there are certain people where you're gonna rely on that senior enlisted leader to engage a group of senior enlisted, or you and the boss together can communicate certain messages, right? So maybe your presence there just reinforces support for those key messages. Or maybe if I want to connect with military spouses, right? Maybe a trusted military spouse and a well-recognized influential military spouse is the most appropriate and best one to deliver it. Doesn't mean that anyone else can't, but it just adds that little something extra. And I think you think about that from the point of, trust and competence and credibility. So who is the person most competent and credible to deliver the message at that time?
There's also a moment, Paul, too, where I need to protect my boss, and maybe I got to get into it on someone. I gotta, for lack of a better term, knife hand them and really lay into them, let them know they are not performing, they're not meeting our expectations, and I need them to step it up. and I'm protecting my boss from that conversation, because that might be the person that has to do the relieving if we get there. And so allowing me to do the course correction and protecting that individual is important. Conversely, when I've got
you and I, like, honestly, we saw this, right? And I hate these distinctions per se, but hey, there's kind of a blue collar flavor to communicating to an enlisted force, right? It's kind of like white collar communicating to union, right? So there are people that are more, I can go in with a certain language set that my boss just won't come across as authentic, right? You're not going to deliver that message with the expletives that I can add to it with credibility, right? And I'm not saying I use those to manipulate, but I come with those from an authentic place that connects. So there's terms and language that we use differently in certain situations that you're not going to have anyone else deliver. Does that make sense?
Right. It does. And I think really to your point is the reason you reserve and rarely use certain words is because if you did it all the time, it wouldn't have meaning.
Yep. Absolutely.
But the moment I come, off the top rope with some words or some body language or that sort of thing and some serious points, it's well received and it's understood. Whereas I don't need the boss doing that. One, because there's a lack of authenticity, but two, I want to protect that individual.
Yep.
And maybe if I could even flip this a little bit too, Paul, is that second leader, whatever you want to call them, XO, senior enlisted leader, senior vice president, is the other person that has to lead up to. And when our emperor, for lack of a better term, has no clothes on, our commander is doing things that isn't necessarily in line with the ethics, the core values of our organization, we are that person that has to communicate up, and only we can do that, because otherwise, a lieutenant in the Navy having a conversation with a Commodore on a ship and telling them to get their stuff together is not going to go well. But the command master chief doing that, absolutely, it's going to go well. Or that Commodore may not be there much longer if they have the moral courage to have that conversation, and the Commodore has the sense to listen. So I think there's some other things to that too that the audience should be mindful of. Is it's not just down, but it could be up as well.
And then the natural skill sets of speakers, right? So there's been, I remember times when, I work for flag officers and they're like, hey, you out communicate most of the flag officers I see, so you're best positioned to do this. And I'd have to be, well, no, then you need to deliver the message. If I'm a stronger communicator, I will complicate the message. But then it got into a situation where I'm like, okay, I don't want to over communicate my boss either, right? So again, just knowing the natural communication skills of people. Maybe some people are better writers, right? So, the message from that person in the street communication plan is written. Certain people light it up on social media, right? So it's like, okay. So I think you've got to consider that when you're discussing who the messenger should be.
That is so important. There's a maturity level there that you got to have in private with that leader.
Yeah.
A couple of assignments I've had where I was very aware that in front of an audience, I could deliver a message that would be better received, but I never wanted to show up my boss. And so I would pull myself back unless they asked me to deliver it for them. And then I would always advise, let me do this as you've departed, or I'll just do it on my own, so that it doesn't come across as I'm showing you up or anything, because I don't want any confusion who's in charge.
Absolutely.
Period. And so that is a maturity level. I hope your audience listens to you, Paul. Yep. They have to be self-aware. They got to look in the mirror and have that honest, humble conversation with the leader. And it's going to oftentimes be the CMC, because you've been doing this for so long.
Yeah.
And if you get a brand new commander, maybe 05 or 06 level, they have not. All right. And so this is not about who's a better individual, but who's got more sets and reps at doing this, and how do you as a command team affect change collectively together.
Yep. And it's just a comfort, it's never done. Normally, these, like when I got those call outs, it wasn't like I deliberately did that. I just had a natural propensity to be able to communicate those ways in a way that people recognize. In some cases, I didn't even recognize them myself. So once I knew about that, I'm like, okay, again, it was a maturity to be able to recognize, okay, I'm a very strong messenger. I recognize my boss, or maybe not even my boss, but the intended messenger of this isn't a strong communicator. So it's a delicate balance there that people got to consider. And hopefully we've explained that enough at that point.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you something, Paul. You're a very effective communicator and extraordinary at it. Multiple times published guy. So I'm not surprised at that. Maybe I'm only surprised that you didn't realize it. But yeah.
Yep.
But I think the one thing I would pull out of this if I was the audience is the maturity to have that conversation in private to
Absolutely.
really get after it. Yep.
Yep. And I even see it civilian sector in my current job with Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. There's the opportunity. I don't do, big speeches or anything like that, but there's been an opportunity to, like when we do Community Impact Day and doing interviews with different people, I'm very comfortable in the space. So you see a lot of people, again, are comfortable with communicating using these tools or public speaking. So again, knowing the messenger and knowing what their comfort level and their competence is a key part. That's the point. All right. The other point, it's not going to be captured in the plan necessarily. I think it should be, but you got to talk about, anytime you talk about communication, sender, receiver, feedback loop, there's noise and barriers. So what are some of the noise and barriers to strategic kind of communication at higher levels? One-on-one, it could be like, okay, it's not just my personal skill delivery, my ability to deliver a message, but it could be, hey, we're on the flight deck, so I've got noise in the background, physical kind of barriers. Once you move up organizationally, there's other barriers to consider. What are some of the ones you've run into or had to advise people on?
Well, let's take what's currently going on in the world today. As I don't want to minimize it by using the word noise. I'm just going to, you mentioned it. But we have for years now talked about pivoting to the Pacific, about really going all in on the great power competition and being mindful of our pacing threat, which is China, and our national security strategy, our national defense strategy, all has us focused there. And so the secretary has told the service chiefs and the services and the combatant commands, we're all over there. However, Central Command and Global Peace is not broken out in the Middle East. And so while those strategies come out, the noise I would often hear would be from a lot of people that have been doing this a long time, either in uniform or civilians that are professionals. And they would often say, that's great, we want to focus there, but this is going to happen here and we better be ready, and so on and so forth. And that doesn't mean they're wrong. But at the end of the day, what our leadership is saying is we've got to focus over here. We'll react. And maybe we should plan a little better for those ad hoc situations. But the reality is everything we're doing for the long-term threat and for the long-term challenges, building a joint force prepared to take on great power competition against China, Russia, and so on and so forth, knowing that force would be able to execute operations there. So I think that's some of the things, you find this a lot, and you can pick other subjects as well, but you'll find this for people that have been in one place for too long often. And so they'll talk about, well, back in my day, or they're, the good old boy network or whatever the case may be. And they can't get past the fact that technology has evolved. The adversary has evolved. The financial sector, global financial sector has evolved. Diplomacy has evolved. I mean, we see that continuing to be challenged. And so while the enemy always gets a vote, I think that is often in the department where that noise is coming from, instead of saying, yes, however, our guiding documents and our national level leadership has said, this is where we got to focus and we got to move out. And go after it. So I think that's just one example of recent ones that, quite frankly, if we have this conversation 5 years from now, 15 years from now, probably 100 years from now, there's still going to be some things going on in the Middle East, and we got to be prepared for that, to handle that. But the greater challenge for our nation is absolutely a competition with China.
So I'm with you on that. I was going to say the number one I had written down was kind of misalignment of message, right? And not, or inability to align, because there are competing messages as you move down. So if I'm at a strategic level and I've got a strategic message I'm trying to push out, every subordinate level below me has priorities too, right? Based on their piece of the pie. So they're communicating to their people. So the farther and farther you get down, you just see stacked messaging coming out, right? So, and if that messaging isn't aligned to the broader message, and it gets very complicated in organizations where each individual unit below is a separate, basically individual business, right? With their own priorities, their own perhaps strategic communication plan, your message can easily get pushed aside or diluted. Or at the very bottom receiver, they're just kind of saturated with messaging already. So they hear lofty words and they're like, I can't take any more messaging, kind of thing. You've seen that, I think. Does that make sense what I'm trying to explain?
It does. Here's an example specific to that. I think the department incorrectly says people first. It's never people first. It is always mission first. That's sad to hear. However, if it was people first, we would do risk and mitigation, and we wouldn't put them in situations in order to accomplish a mission where they may die. Yep. That is our mission. We signed up for this. Whatever service you're in, there's a potential for great harm to come, and we know that. But the mission and everything always comes first. There's a reason our shipmates are extended out at sea often. If it was people first, we'd fly them home. They got to see their kids. Yeah. We got to care about their people. And that doesn't mean we don't care about them. We do. We love our shipmates, our sailors, our Marines, and so on and so forth, our soldiers. But the mission always in the department has to come first. And so when we put out this thing, this narrative that it's people first, it's disingenuous, in my opinion. It's not accurate. And it's missing the honesty that our service members know, and they know we're not giving it to them straight. Instead of saying, listen, the mission is always going to come first. I'm going to do everything I can to take care of you, whether that means getting you the right barracks, the right pay, the right training, whatever the case may be. But no one will ever come before the mission. Just like I tell my daughters, they will never come before my wife, right? And that's a hard conversation to have. But in all honesty, I think we miss it every single time we say that, because it's not accurate historically, and it's not true.
Yeah. And another one I think as you get up again is this kind of geographical distance that can be challenging, but now with modern tools again, you've got in-person opportunities, right? So geographically you may be constrained by budget, right? Like, well, I can't afford to fly you out to go speak one-on-one, but now using these kind of tools, you just got to consider things like time change, and again, but these kind of new tools to reach out, man, I do those now, during Chiefs initiation when I get invited to speak to groups. I don't need to fly out there now. I can just huddle them up. They go in a room. I come up on a screen and I can communicate very effectively. Yeah, it misses a bit of the impersonal touch, and there's things you miss. But overall, any other advice on geographical distance and how to manage communication that way?
No, there's a variety of ways. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to build a team, I think physically you need to be there, because there's things you got to do, whether that's embracing shared hardships, having a social and breaking bread, and just building that trust. If you're strengthening or reinforcing something you already have, or you're just there as a guest communicator, there's no reason more often than not you can't do this virtual. And you and I have done these, since I've been retired. I've done a couple of global ones where I've been in my office at midnight because the audience is up at a different time frame, and I'll do a keynote with them and deliver, and it's virtual. Not only do we save an awful lot of money, but the 3 days it would have taken to get there, and all these other things just wasn't worth the time. So you got to balance that out. What are you trying to accomplish? And I think if you're trying to build a team, you got to be there physically to build. But after that, if you've already got the team, hey, I just got to see my shipmates. How we doing? Let me jump on a Zoom real quick and talk to you. That's good to go. You speaking to a group of sailors to deliver a keynote or to get a couple themes across. Yeah, absolutely. Why would you not do that virtual? Because if you showed up physically, you're going to show up for an hour and then you're just going to leave. So it wouldn't even make sense now with modern technology.
Absolutely.
So I think you got to use the tools to the best of your ability, make smart sense of your time, and understand the objectives you're trying to accomplish, and then use the tool necessary to achieve that objective.
Yeah. And back to the plan, right? So many times you'll see, in particular with senior enlisted leaders and positions where they're traveling around, right? So it's great to go be able to travel or whatever, but what's the purpose? Is it tied to the plan, or not even the plan, the governance, right? Like the decision-making on policy. So if you're going to go out and travel face-to-face, sure, you can message to them on behalf of the boss. I think that's one thing we do, but you better be gathering feedback and something to bring back into governance as well. remember, it's two-way communication. So it's not just the message down. I think those audiences, one of the things you're trying to accomplish is the feedback from the broader audience, right? So that's a piece, I think, of the deliverables that we talked about before. But there's many times where I think people go out and travel and they love travel and there's cool places to go and travel, but they don't connect it to any kind of plan or sense of purpose or kind of some deliverable they own their boss. I love that point you made about in-person and team building and trust building. Yeah, I can't measure that. That's what we would call it soft ROI in the realm I do of outreach. But there is there is definitely value to that. But it's got to be, again, accounted for in that plan, right? So if you're going to have a person go out, identify the key times when that's going to be, what are those events? Because again, if this gets into budgets, you've got to account for that. But you got to be able to understand what the intended return, again, like we said, what is the intended outcome of that engagement? In some cases you can't measure it. Some cases you can.
You hear this more in the private sector and the commercial sector than you do in the department. Matter of fact, I don't think I've ever heard it in the department, but this idea of we are out of money, now we have to think. Yeah. And that's the same bit, right? So there's a time and a place where a company will invest $10,000, $20,000, whatever the case may be, to fly you out to speak, to do something, and then to come back. And you'll do that analysis, that ROI, and say, you know what, the juice is worth the squeeze. In the department, oftentimes you would just get on a plane and go do that because you don't have to necessarily, although you should, you oftentimes didn't have to think of the money as much. Yeah. But the one thing that is often missing, and when you have leaders that are traveling all over the place for the sake of traveling, is the other message that can often convey is a lack of trust. If I'm always, I've got to be out to these units all the time, why don't I just trust the commander and the senior enlisted leader that are there? Okay. There's a time I got to come out there. I got to see some things. I may want to, say goodbye to them as they get ready to leave on a deployment or whatever. But if I'm there all day with the admiral, the general, whatever, or if it's just me, the other message it could come across is, wow, I don't know if they trust me. It's almost like that IG getting out there. Yeah. So you just got to be mindful of that. And I don't think when I traveled, people thought I was inspecting them or checking up on them, except to know that they've got, the narrative from my boss and they're executing, and I just want to see how they're doing.
Yep.
But if you don't do that the right way, it could come across as missing that trust, and then it's counterproductive to everything you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And I think that's a future episode too, particularly for senior enlisted leaders and senior officers too, or staffs that travel around. Is like, it's not just when you go out there, hey, how do you do battlefield circulation? How do you make the most effective use of it and get the biggest ROI? What are the things you can do, or what are the things we advise you not to do? So I'll write that down as a topic. All right. So we've covered a lot. So I'm going to throw it over to you we could keep going for an hour, but we're already a bit longer than I typically like to go, but it's good discussion. So closing thoughts, over to you.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this subjects of leadership, and how a lot of things that are out there today kind of start you at the back end of it, right? You want to know about leadership. I can read a book from an admiral or someone like that. But I want to know how you get there. What are the things you have to do? And one of the things I would offer to the audience here is there's a book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it is one of the greatest books ever written for uniform members, for business members, for anyone. I keep it with me at all times when I travel. And I've read it, a dozen times or so, but I'll just open up a couple pages as I'm getting ready to meet a client. And make sure, okay, I'm reminded when I have that handshake, my body language, I'm squaring my shoulders, I'm looking them in the eye, and I win the handshake professionally, being kindness, remember their first name, send a follow-up email, little tiny things like that. Focusing on the process, not the outcome, allows you to get there. And then there's a lot of other things. There's intangibles before you get on the stage as a guest speaker, making sure all of the work, your subject. I mean, these things people may not think of, or they think, yeah, I got it, but they matter. Are you getting the appropriate amount of sleep? Are you hydrated? I mean, I can go on and on as well, but I'll just start and end with that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It captures everything we're talking about here, whether you're in uniform or not. and it's so good. But that last piece there, and Paul, you say this better than anyone, is if you're going to be communicating effectively and you're going to try to grow up that corporate ladder or the promotion ladder in the armed forces, you need to be dedicating some time to your own personal development, reading, listening to key speakers so that you can grow as well. Otherwise, you're going to stay where you currently are, but you're expecting to get promoted to that next level, and that's not going to happen. So, Paul, I always love having these conversations with you. Like I said, you call, I'm answering. I'll be there for you, brother. It's good to have this, shipmate. So thank you very much for the time today. And if folks want to find me, they can look for me on YouTube. I started my own channel there, or on LinkedIn as I get moving out with Stalker Solutions. So thanks again, sir.
No, some great insights, and hopefully people see now how this progresses, right? So you learn interpersonal skills, and then you learn to talk to increasing groups of people, public speaking, and you're honing this skill set, right? Your reading is enhancing your vocabulary, and your ability. Reading makes writing better, it makes speaking better. So when you get in these positions where you're integrated, hopefully into a strategic communication plan, you can deliver your piece of that thing. And that's kind of the goal of this. So hopefully we've raised some awareness of strategic communication, what it's about, what the components are. I'd encourage you, if you're in these positions, a couple things. So number one, have you reviewed your organization's strategic plan, and do you understand your role in it? Is your role even identified? If you are a senior enlisted leader on a flag staff or something else, do you have a targeted audience? Do you have a role? Do you have your specific messages that are aligned with the broader messages? And what are the channels that you can communicate at? And when you do go out and travel to engage geographically, what is the message you're going to deliver? Who are you going to deliver to? And what are you going to bring back to the headquarters? Number two, I just touched on this, but if you're in a role that requires you to travel, engage with a geographically dispersed audience, are you engaging with a purpose that ties back to your organization's strategic comm plan or management governance? And number three, how well are you using all the channels of communication available to you and your staff to communicate with a broad and dispersed audience? And where can you and your staff improve? And what channels of communication can you better utilize? So hopefully we've given you some time to really reflect on that. Scott, thanks again. I will take you up on that offer. There's a ton of topics we can continue to cover, but good luck to you. And I'm sure we'll be in touch more. Everyone, that'll do it for this episode of the Cutlass Podcast. To learn about this topic and more, make sure to check out the Chief Petty Officer's Guide or the Petty Officer's Guide now that's out there through U.S. Naval Institute. You can find those on their Books and Press tab. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the Cutlass Podcast on your podcast channel. Like, share, offer me feedback, and help spread the content to those who can use it to improve. You can also check out my YouTube channel. I've got one too, although I kind of haven't been doing too much content. There's about 11 videos there. It's called Paul's Cutlass Classroom. But with these videos now, hopefully I can add to that. As always, this is Paul Kingsbury. Work to keep that leadership cutlass sharp, and then take what you learn to go out and build great teams and make a positive difference in the lives of others. Until the next episode, good luck to you.